Nobody wants to shut government down. Nobody wants to stop the park rangers from getting their salary or their teachers from getting their salary. What we want, though, is not to give up and say, oh, just do whatever you want like it's always been.
That is now Senator Rand Paul, along with his father. It turns out they're going to be roommates.
Yes, we're waiting for the reality show. Watch out, Jersey Shore. We've got the two Pauls. Top Line starts right now.
Hello and welcome to ABC News Top Line. I'm Rick Klein.
And I'm Amy Walter.
Every day at noon Eastern, or right here with the latest in politics. It's twitter.com/Rick Klein, twitter.com/Amy E. Walter. Amy, it is good to be back behind the mug.
I know, and I'm so glad to be sitting in this spot. That chair makes me nervous.
It's set for me.
Clearly. All right. Let's start off with our first top lines today. Mr. Speaker. Yes, that's right. Just a few years after he handed the gavel to Nancy Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi hands it back to now soon-to-be Speaker John Boehner. He brings almost every member of his extended family, his 10 brothers and sisters. We hear there's going to be a lot of Kleenex available.
Well, the big question is, we know that John Boehner is going to cry, but will Nancy Pelosi cry? She's not nearly as emotional a person. But this is dramatic. It's not often that you have the transfer of power, obviously, and just that moment from just 4 years ago where she achieved this lifelong dream of becoming the House Speaker. Now for her to have to give that back to John Boehner, a man with different ambitions, and he's been there a long time and a much different agenda, of course.
But the American dream, as we all know.
As we know. Next up today, Gibbs's goodbye. Confirmation out of the White House today that Robert Gibbs, the White House press secretary, is on the way out. He'll be moving on to a job in the private sector in just a few weeks' time. Big speculation around what the next move will be over at the White House. A couple of names in hopper for replacements. They're all insiders for the most part. There's a lot of continuity for all the change that's going on right now, and a mixed legacy for Robert Gibbs. I mean, look, he took a lot of flack for what he did from the podium, but I think overall a pretty effective spokesman for the president's agenda.
And I got to believe he's still going to be sitting in Chicago for much of 2012, right?
That's right.
Moving on now, $100 billion, give or take 50 billion or so. News today that maybe, just maybe, the Republican commitment to cutting $100 billion from the budget may be a little too much. Now there's talk that what's more realistic is going back to a maybe $50 or $60 billion cut. Republicans argue that, well, let's face it, that we didn't really get a budget in 2011, so we are starting from a different point.
Right.
It's a lot of gymnastics here over the language. The bottom line, it's a lot tougher to make those cuts, and Democrats are going to be giddy about the fact that they can go into a 2012 election talking about teachers and park rangers and everybody else.
That's right. $50 billion is a lot of money, too, by the way. And so far, all we've heard is $35 million worth of cuts. That'll be enacted today. Those are within the House's budget.
$35 million.
That's you can run the math. You're better at math than we are at home. And finally today, Bachmann overdrive. Word from our reporter, John Parkinson, who covers the House for ABC, had a scoop this morning that Michelle Bachmann, a Republican congresswoman from Minnesota, is mulling a campaign for president in 2012. She'll be making a trip to Iowa later this month, and she's got some more travel on the horizon. And wow, will she be an interesting candidate if she does indeed run.
She will be, but I think we've learned a lot, though, over just the last couple of years. She has not been able to bring as many people into the Tea Party caucus. Remember, she's the self-described leader of this caucus. So that suggests to me maybe as a presidential candidate, she may have some trouble sort of generating the kind of enthusiasm and money and grassroots she thinks she may.
There will be hurdles there, and we'll talk about it actually on Friday. She'll be our guest on Top Line on Friday. In the meantime, a few minutes ago, right before the start of the new congressional session, Amy and I spent some time with Congressman Henry Cuellar, who's the vice chairman of the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee, a member of House leadership, will be very critical on the health care and budget issues. Take a look at the interview. Congressman Cuellar, welcome to Top Line. Thank you for being here. I want to ask you, first of all, what is the mood like today among the House Democratic caucus? You come back to town. There are fewer of your colleagues around. Of course, the gavel is getting handed over to the Republicans. What are Democrats talking about?
Well, I think one of the things that we're looking forward in the sense that, we are going to have opportunities to work with our Republican majority. And I certainly want to thank and congratulate John Boehner as the new speaker and the new majority coming in. We will try to work with them on a bipartisan basis. We can find common ground. But on the points that we do disagree, I think we will disagree, but we'll do it in a very civil way.
Well, I want to bring up that point, Congressman, just in terms of where you can work together. I know that one of your new jobs on the Policy Steering Committee is deficit reduction. Can you give us one example where you think Democrats, Republicans can agree on the issue of deficit reduction?
Well, you're right. You know, we are going to be applying a three-part test. Does it reduce the deficit? Does it create jobs? Does it help the middle class? And on that using that three-part test, we will apply that to see where we can find common ground. I will say that we all want to reduce the deficit. We need to apply the pay-go, which is so important because in the 1990s, we did create a surplus for the first time in so many years. So we need to make sure we apply the pay-go. So the first thing is, instead of just cutting across the board blindly, we ought to set priorities for the United States, what's important for our government, education, transportation, security. And then after that, we got to go case by case to see where we should cut. But to cut across the board, that's not the right approach. We ought to look at what works and what doesn't work, get rid of the inefficiencies that we have in our government, which is, I think we can find a lot of common ground on that.
Well, Republicans are talking about cutting $50 billion, maybe even $100 billion, actual cuts in the first fiscal year that they're in power. Is that a reasonable goal? Is that a realistic target?
Well, I think they start off with $100 billion. I hear now that they might reduce it down a little bit more. You know, running a campaign is very different from governing. So, you know, we got to see where, if we're going to cut, where are we going to cut? It is possible.
Is that goal though possible?
Well, you know, $100 billion is a lot of money. But again, before we just set up an arbitrary number, we ought to see what programs, what agencies work and what don't, and then from there we start making the cuts. We do need to reduce the deficit.
Yes, and to that point, Congressman, what Republicans are saying is let's just bring the budget down to the 2008 level. So whatever the level of funding you had in 2008, that's what you've got coming up in this next fiscal year. Do you think that is doable?
You know, I believe that, you know, we ought to run government like a business, but the only big difference between running a government and a business is that the population of the United States has grown a lot. We just got a census. There's still certain needs out there. I still think that we can cut. I don't know if we can get up to the $100 billion. We want to see their proposal. Let's see what their specific proposals, and then we'll take it to see if we can find common ground.
I want to ask you about the battle that's going to be joined in just the next couple of days over health care. What is the Democratic defense going to look like? Clearly, the repeal is going to fail, but then they're going to go point by point, in some areas try to defund health care's implementation, in other places just try to take out specific provisions. How are Democrats going to defend against that?
Well, first of all, you know, the majority's new position is just repeal and then try to come up with something. I don't think that's the right approach. You know, if you look at any legislative body at the state level, at the local level, even at the federal government, what you ought to do is you look at a piece of legislation and say, okay, this works, this doesn't work, and then make the modifications, fine-tune the legislation. But to just clear up everything, start all new, and start that fight again, that's not the right approach. We ought to, I'll be the first one to say we ought to modify the bill, the legislation. I'll be the first one to say, but just to repeal and then think about what we're going to come up with, I don't think that's the right approach that the majority's taking.
Well, to that point, would you then be willing to work with Republicans as they put together, they're committed, and they say, to put together another bill that is going to address some of these issues, that there would be basically a different bill voted on the floor that addresses some of the health care concerns? Do you think that Democrats would be willing to work with Republicans to craft something different?
Well, again, to modify the legislation that we have, I think you can find a lot of common ground, without a doubt. You know, for example, remember, keep in mind that what passed was a Senate bill, not the House bill. There was no conference committee. I had some things, for example, that I had in the House bill, tort reform, some of the language to get rid of duplicative programs. It passed the House, but it never got to the Senate. It never got over here. So there are areas that we can find common ground. But just to repeal and then start all over again, if you're talking about creating uncertainty, that will create uncertainty.
I want to ask you, in just a little while now, the Democratic conference is going to formally elect Speaker Pelosi. Now Speaker Pelosi, soon to be Minority Leader Pelosi instead. But Heath Cuellar is still in the running there, and it's been sort of a vehicle for Democrats to vent frustrations with the current leadership. How many votes do you think Heath Cuellar is going to get, and what kind of signals does that send on the first day of the new Congress?
You know, we already had that vote, and Pelosi came out with the strong majority. And again, I know Cuellar, I'm a member of the Blue Dog coalition myself. He's a good man. But what we wanted to look was the big picture. We decided to go with Pelosi. And as you know, Pelosi has made some changes already. She put Debbie Wasserman as one of the vice chairs. She put me as a blue dog, being from the South also, being part of the vice chair. So we will have a lot of input as to what the policy will be for the Democratic caucus. Trying to find the center will be very important for us. And I know we can do that.
All right, Congressman Cuellar, we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for joining us here on Top Line.
Thank you so much.